Entrepreneurs are usually great as creators but fail to be strategic, and established companies, on the other hand, can be overtly strategic but fail to have that real spark. In the end, both of these become very good at something. Excellence is their best possible outcome, but not brilliance, because excellence isn't brilliance. When you become excellent at something, that very expertise becomes your dominant lens into the world. Psychologically, your worldview shrinks to accommodate that excellence, and that is why it becomes like an expertise, right? Like a focus, a deep focus. And that very expertise takes away the need to be developing the same level of intensity in other areas. For example, a great creator relies on the brilliance of her idea or creation and wouldn't really feel the need to do much else. That's like the most default option for first generation entrepreneurs. Everything happens as a default. Or, for example, let's say a company that has years of legacy in a particular industry, has a great system going. That company will hardly be the one to innovate anything exponential. It'll only be incremental in its disruption quotient. And so neither is brilliance, because brilliance is about having the complete game and not just a wonderful sideshow or something. And therefore, I took the time to write Strategic Brilliance. For no matter what your circumstances, you could be an entrepreneur, a startup, an established company, an employer, a co-founder. Strategic Brilliance gives you guidance. It gives you strategy. You could be a hugely successful entrepreneur. You could be a phenomenal executive, or you could be someone who's just gone bust a couple of times. The book gives you a way, believe it or not, to take everything to a level of brilliance. It isn't hope. This is actionable, it is meaningful, it is immediate, it's profitable, it's strategic guidance and help. It's an integrated theory of brilliance, not just mere excellence. The applied outcome or the end outcome is that you will have a map to create for yourself the brilliance, no matter what your situation or circumstance. Thank you.
Good evening. We are very excited to begin our next discussion, The World of India's First Archaeologist, Letters from Alexander Cunningham to JDM Beglar. Dr. Sanjukta Datta will be in conversation with Professor Dr. Upinder Singh. Professor Dr. Upinder Singh has authored Ancient Delhi, The Discovery of Ancient India, Early Archaeologist and the Beginning of Archaeology, a history of ancient and early medieval India from Stone Age to the 12th century, among several other books. She's also co-edited Ancient India, New Research, Asian Encounters, Exploring Connected Histories, and Buddhism in Asia, Revival and Rejuvenation. Her most recent books include Ancient India, Culture of Coordinations, and The World of India's First Archaeologist, Letters from Alexander Cunningham to JDM Beglar. Our next guest, Dr. Sanjukta Datta. Sanjukta Datta is Assistant Professor in the Department of History at Ashoka University. She's earlier taught at Stephens College and Gargi College, University of Delhi. A scholar of ancient history, she works on inscriptions from the ancient and early medieval periods. Her research interests focus on kingship, patronage, trans-religion, Buddhist networks, and documentary cultures, especially in Eastern India. I now request Dr. Datta to take this conversation further. Thank you.
Hello, Ms. Singh.
Hello.
Hello. I think her internet connection is lost, but we can chat till she comes. And I don't know if you've had a discussion with her about this. I know very little about archaeology, actually, but maybe we could start. You could start telling us about your book.
Sure. And in fact, I think I should introduce the protagonist, the chief protagonist of my book.
Okay.
Um, I think many of your viewers would have heard of Alexander Cunningham, a very well known 19th century archaeologist. He's often referred to as the father of Indian archaeology. I'm not sure I like these patriarchal terms, but he was an extremely important and influential figure in the 19th century. He came to India as a 19-year-old, and he had a career as a military engineer. And soon after he came to India, he got very inspired and passionate about coins, about ancient history, about archaeology. He came under the influence of James Prinsep, another great luminary of 19th century antiquarianism. And he pursued archaeology as a part time occupation on the side when he was free from his duties as a military engineer. But he went on to have a formal role in the history of Indian archaeology. He became archaeological surveyor to the government of India. And remember, this is the British government of India. This is the colonial period between 1861 and 65. And then he was called back when the Archaeological Survey of India was established in 1871. Cunningham was called back to India, and he was Director General of the ASI for many years. So he's a very important and influential figure in the formative phase of the history of archaeology in India. JDM Beglar is probably somebody whom fewer people would know about. He was an Armenian settled in Bengal, uh, in a place called Chakdaha, and he worked for the Public Works Department. But he had a passion for archaeology. And when Alexander Cunningham came to India as Director General of the Archaeological Survey of India, he got in touch with Beglar. He had heard about Beglar's interest in archaeology. He had heard about Beglar's interest in photography. And he wrote to Beglar asking him if he would join him and become a member, become an employee of the Archaeological Survey of India. So this is how the survey started, with three men, basically: Alexander Cunningham, JDM Beglar, and ACL Carlyle, who was the other archaeological assistant. So what you see in this book is a collection of letters that were written, actually 192 letters that were written by Alexander Cunningham to JDM Beglar, his assistant, and, as we shall discover, also his very close friend, between 1871 and 1885. So these letters are a very exciting window into the discovery of India's early past. The letters tell us about the exciting expeditions, the explorations that were conducted by Cunningham and Beglar. And it's a very new and kind of ringside view of archaeological work that we get from these letters. So that, briefly speaking, is what this book is about. I have reproduced all the letters, 192 of them. They were handwritten letters, but I've painfully and faithfully transcribed them so that what you see on the printed page are what the words of Alexander Cunningham as he wrote them. And I've written a long introduction for those who want to know about what these letters are all about.
So it must have involved a lot of research, right? I mean, finding all these letters and going through them, and actually, actually finding references to them. And so, how did you go about the research?
Well, I'd already worked on the history of archaeology. In 2004, I had published a book titled The Discovery of Ancient India: Early Archaeologists and the Beginnings of Archaeology. For that book, and by the way, that book, like many good things in life, started due to a very chance encounter. And so did this one. So I must tell you the story. Sometime in 1997, I was sitting in the Archaeological Survey library, and I asked for a book that I heard about. It was a kind of interesting, juicy sort of book. It was by the architectural historian James Ferguson. And the title of the book was The Archaeology of India, with special reference to Rajendra Lal Mitra. Rajendra Lal Mitra was a very well-known, distinguished Indian scholar of the time. And Ferguson wrote this very nasty, racist kind of diatribe against Rajendra Lal Mitra. He published it. He had the audacity to publish it. So I wanted to read the book. And when I asked for a copy of the book, what came into my hands was something that just amazed me. It was a book where somebody had scrawled all kinds of things in pencil on different pages and had written all kinds of outraged comments all over the place. And on several pages, I found the name of JDM Beglar stamped on the book. So I realized this was the personal copy of someone named JDM Beglar. I knew Beglar was an assistant of Alexander Cunningham's, and that very chance discovery got me interested in the history of Indian archaeology in the 19th century. So over the next 5 years, I went over each and every book, each and every article, each and every file in the National Archives of India or in the Oriental and India Office Collection, of the British Library, everything written by Alexander Cunningham about Alexander Cunningham. And ultimately, the book that came out of that research, which included looking at both published work and also government files, department files, archival material, that book was published in 2004. So I already knew about the background to Indian archaeology in the 19th century. I'd written about that formative phase, and Alexander Cunningham played a very important role in that book. He was one of the central figures, but the book also did talk about Beglar and Carlyle, his assistants. The book talked about the discovery and the conservation and also the destruction of sites in early colonial times. It also discussed the role of Indian scholars and the Indian princes in the discovery and the conservation of monuments and sites. So that was a very comprehensive study. What came to my notice in around 2005, I think, I was attending a conference in Kolkata, and I heard that Victoria Memorial Hall had acquired a set of letters written by Alexander Cunningham. So I made some inquiries and found that that was indeed so. And then the directors, curators of the Victoria Memorial Hall were very kind enough to show interest in my interest in the letters. I managed to get copies of the letters and I read them. And as I read them, I realized that this is an amazing, astonishing new source, which is telling us things about the history of archaeology that were not known about before. It's telling us about the great discoveries of the 19th century, the discoveries of sites, the nitty-gritty of archaeological expeditions, the interpersonal relationships, all the details about archaeology at that time, which the government files and the published books and articles did not have anything to say about. So this was really a very exciting new source, and that is what you will find. You will find these letters reprinted in this book, as I said, with a detailed introduction. So it's in a sense, this book is a continuation of my earlier interest in the history of Indian archaeology in the 19th century, but it's something completely new. It is bringing together the professional and the personal in a very, very, very interesting way. You're seeing how the minds of archaeologists were working, where they were going, how they made their plans, how they made their itineraries, how they organized their communication. It wasn't easy for Cunningham to know where to post his letter to when he wanted to write to Beglar, because he had to anticipate Beglar's itinerary and where he was traveling, so on and so forth. So they give us a very interesting behind the scenes look at what was actually happening in the field of archaeology in the 19th century.
Yes, you got a kind of a clear picture. It's like visualizing the past in a way, right?
Absolutely.
So, yeah, so basically, I'm a thriller writer. So my interest in history is limited to history that I use in my thrillers. And I find myself, getting involved in my characters and all that. So when you write your books, and you have, dived so deep into history, like for these letters, and you said that you can imagine and visualize the whole of it. Do you find yourself getting attached or emotionally involved in any of your writing, in any of these characters? For me, they're characters which come and go. I mean, do you get involved like that anytime? Do you find that?
Well, that's a very interesting question. My training as a historian demands a certain amount of detachment and objectivity. So when I look at the material, whether it is government files, whether it is published material, whether it is in this case letters, I have to be true to my kind of, the discipline of history. So I have to maintain a certain critical, objective stance. But, as I think as I'm growing older, um, I'm finding it more and more difficult to do that, frankly, because I find, especially when you're dealing with human beings, and one of the things that really stands out in both my works on archaeology is that I've tried to show how people matter in the building of institutions. And here you have these very fascinating characters. One is a Scotsman who comes to India and gets, bowled over by antiquarianism. Another is, again, an engineer who's working with the public works department. What could be more dreary than that? And he gets completely obsessed with archaeology. So, as I worked on this material over the years, I actually did, I found it difficult to remain completely objective. I did form a certain opinion about Cunningham. I did come to have a certain admiration for his approach to his work, for his dedication, for his personality also, because he comes across as, and this is something that the letters reveal, not only as passionate about archaeology, but as a wonderfully warm human being, considerate, friendly, affectionate also, because the letters talk about his friendships with Beglar and others. They talk about his relationships with his sons. He had two sons. One was with the Indian Civil Service. One was in the Roorkee Engineering College. He talks about his late wife, his granddaughters. So the human angle, I think, is extremely important, even for me. And I find that when you are working with material of this kind, in which you see an expression of people's ideas about their expression of their emotions, their fears, their ambitions, their inner conflicts, it is very difficult to remain completely unmoved by what you are reading.
In continuation to what I asked you before, I mean, for example, when I finish a book, there is still a lot of attachment to it. I mean, even so do you, that's number one of part one of the question. Do you feel a kind of sadness when you've completed a project? Okay. Secondly, I have met some historians, who keep saying that history is always colored. When you represent it, it's always colored. How true is that when you combine archaeological history? So I'd love to know these two things.
Well, I'm happiest when I'm in the middle of a book, because that's then the first thing I think about when I wake up in the morning, and the last thing I think about when I go to bed. So my mind is constantly working. It's constantly working with the material that is part of the book. And when a book is complete, what do I feel? Well, there is not a sense of sadness, I would say, but certainly a feeling of emptiness and feeling of, what next? Because, for so many years, and because these research projects do actually involve, and most of my books have meant an investment of time of about 5 years from start to publication. So
Wow.
it's something that's been with me for a very long time. So there is a satisfaction, of course, in seeing the book in print, but there's also a feeling of emptiness and also boredom, waiting for the next project to come along so that you can get swept away by it.
Right.
And your second question was about history being
History
colored.
being colored. when historians write about history, they sometimes say that we cannot be objective. I'm trying to take off from what you said, that they can't be objective. So how true is that when you combine history with archaeology in a way?
Well, I think objectivity is important in history as well as in archaeology. And this book is really a history of archaeology. So it brings the two things
Yes.
together, right?
Yeah.
History and archaeology.
Yeah.
And I think a historian and an archaeologist is obliged to be as objective as possible. And of course, there are different approaches to the past. There are different kind of angles that people have when they write about the past. But I feel a true historian, a good historian, in order to stay faithful to the discipline, to the craft of history, has to very self-consciously, uh, you know, examine the sources with an open mind, to see and to analyze and to try to understand what the sources are actually saying, what the voice in which they are speaking, and then to reach conclusions on that basis. So objectivity, I think, is an essential prerequisite in uh, in the discipline of history, and certainly also within archaeology.
So I'm very curious if you could read out one of the letters. I think that would be great if it's possible. I don't know if you decided that with the professor, but we would love to hear something. You read something.
Okay, before I read, I should just tell you a little bit about the letters.
Okay.
These are handwritten letters.
Yeah.
So I, of course, knew Alexander Cunningham's handwriting very well because I'd spent, as I told you, 4
5
years
years.
reading
Yeah.
everything written by him, about him, and I had seen material written by him. But these letters, which, as I said, were in the custody of Victoria Memorial Hall, they did present some challenges in the sense I got the scans of the letters, then the letters had to be transcribed, and I wanted them to be transcribed as faithfully as possible. So what I did was I decided I would retain every full stop, every punctuation mark. For instance, Cunningham used dashes instead of full stops. I retained that. He underlined a lot, that shows that contrary to what his other writing suggests, he seems very prim and proper in his, published work and in the government files. But here he is really kind of excitable, and he's writing to Beglar and he's underlining words and sometimes whole sentences. So I retained all that so that the reader could get a flavor of the letters. So the idea was to try to, just recreate as closely as possible the experience of reading the handwritten letters for the reader of the book. Actually, I can read. There are 2 excerpts, not an entire letters, but one letter that was written on 22nd February 1876. And this is one of the things I found extremely likable about Cunningham, that he was an older scholar, much more experienced than Beglar, much better known, well established. But there's so much affection and also support, especially in times of difficulty when Beglar was going through troubles of various kinds, sickness, personal bereavements. Cunningham was always there to give him a kind of supportive, a feeling of support. So there is one letter which is in front of me, 22nd February 1876, written from Camp Baraich. And the context of the letter, and this is where it starts, is that Beglar had got into some scrap with some villagers in a place that he was doing some archaeological exploration. And he had got extremely upset and he had fallen ill. He was a sickly man. That's one of the things that stands out in these letters, is how the archaeological explorations and the work continued in the midst of all kinds of other experiences, whether it was illness, and sometimes debilitating illness, whether it is personal losses, bereavement, so on and so forth. So the context of this letter is that Beglar had got into a scrap with some villagers, and he had got extremely agitated, and he was quite unwell. His feverish symptoms were accentuated. So this is what Cunningham writes to him. As an older man, as a colleague, and also as a friend, I'm quoting, all of us have had to put up with disagreeable incidents during our careers through life, but people as they grow old get used to them and try to forget them. Let me hope that you will speedily regain your health and forget the troubles you have had. I too have had my troubles, as I have been more or less lame for some time, and am still disabled by the nail of the great toe pressing persistently into the flesh. I had got it quite well, but in the hidden bricks of the Jetavana, I kicked the toe against a piece of the Gandhakuti, this is a Buddhist shrine, and I have been lame ever since. Uh, you know, we know about the great discoveries made by Cunningham, but some of these excerpts, some of these things mentioned in the letters really tell us the human side of the story and indicate that during a lot of the time that Cunningham was making these great discoveries, first of all, he was 57 years old when he became a director general of the Archaeological Survey, and he was in his early 70s when he left India. So he was an elderly man, but he also had all these other kinds of problems. And in this case, as he says, he's been lamish or unable to walk properly ever since this incident happened. So these are some of the insights that the letters give. And welcome back, Sanjukta.
I'm very sorry for that unexpected technical glitch and for leaving you in the lurch. I just couldn't log in for half an hour. Sorry. So could you tell me a little about what you were talking about?
I was talking about the book, about the letters, and about how they reveal interesting aspects of about Indian archaeology and Alexander Cunningham, and just general things about how I related to the letters, whether it was possible for me to remain objective, or whether I got a little involved in the protagonists, and whether it was easy or difficult for me to keep my own kinds of judgments and views aside.
Okay. Thanks for that introduction. So if I may come in now and begin by congratulating you on the publication of what is the first of 2 successive books that you've published this year. And this one, of course, is, I think, a very unusual book because, as I'm sure you've told the audience, it comprises a set of almost 200 letters written by the Director General of Archaeology, Cunningham, to his close assistant, Beglar. If one question that I had when I read the book, 2004, you wrote your Discovery of Ancient India. So you were already quite familiar with Cunningham's career. You'd looked through archaeological survey reports, archival research that you had done. So how was this book similar to and different from that experience, if I could ask you that?
That's an excellent question, Sanjukta, but I've already answered that question while you were away. I discussed, the earlier work and how this was, in a sense, kind of the earlier work formed a backdrop to this, but this was just completely different, simply because these are personal letters, never meant to be read by anybody. So the kind of insights that they gave about what was happening in the world of archaeologists, those details never appeared in the published material or archival sources. The nitty-gritty of the archaeological expeditions, for instance, these are things that never appear in the reports. The reports tell us what was discovered, but in the letters you find out how the archaeologists traveled from one place to another, how sometimes they, Cunningham traveled on elephant back. There were many different types of modes of transport. So apart from elephants, there were camels that also helped transport all the luggage and the tents and all the paraphernalia. They also traveled by bullock train. There were so many. And then, of course, the railways make their appearance as well. So how they traveled, how they arranged for their tents and the food, and how they suffered with the heat and the mosquitoes, and so many things that make our understanding of archaeology human. These letters really humanize the enterprise of archaeology because they tell us what it was like for the people on the ground who were doing archaeology on a day-to-day basis. We hear about their great achievements, their great discoveries, and also their great disappointments on days when they had high hopes. They set off with high hopes and they found nothing. So all this comes across very vividly in the letters.
Okay. How did you work around with the letters? What did you do? Did you arrange them chronologically first, type them out? I ask this because in your book, there are a few photographs of the letters. And for me, it took me a little while to get used to Cunningham's writing. You, of course, have said that because you'd worked earlier with his writing, this was familiar, it wasn't difficult at all. So how was it? What did you do with the letters when they arrived at your desk?
Well, that's also a question I've already answered while you were away, Sanjukta. But I did have, there was a basic transcription that was done, but I had to go over it word for word because the person who had done the first transcription did not know Cunningham's handwriting, but I did. So because I had immersed myself in the man and his work and his writings, for a long time. So I actually went over each word. I used the magnifying glass when I had to. I used the zoom function on the scans. And of course, I did arrange, being a good historian, I arranged the letters chronologically. That's one of the first things that I did. But it wasn't always easy because some of the letters were wrongly attached. The pages were wrongly attached. And sometimes some letters were torn, some were fragmentary. So there were all these sort of mysterious pieces. So it was a bit like, in some cases, a bit like a jigsaw puzzle, trying to figure out which page goes with which page because the way they had been attached did not make sense.
Right. Okay. So I hope I will be asking you a question which you haven't already preempted and answered while I was away, which is 192 odd letters. Could you tell us about at least two which have remained with you? Either memorable, strange, you remember often. It could be anything. Maybe two?
Okay, I partly answered that as well. I did read out a part of a letter. But there is something I have saved up for you, Sanjukta. And, it's not a particular letter that stands out, but there are certain themes, certain threads that run through the letters that really bring out the quality of the man. And I've already read out an excerpt from a letter where he, as an older man, as the boss, actually. I mean, he was Beglar's boss, but he didn't write like a boss. He wrote like a friend, expresses his consideration for him when Beglar is down and out. But the letters that really moved me most were the ones he wrote towards the end of his stay in India, when he was leaving. And when, a lot of his belongings that were being shipped to England on a ship called the Indus, sank because the Indus sank off the coast of Sri Lanka. And along with the Indus, down went a whole lot of Cunningham's precious possessions. And by the way, archaeologists have been wondering about what went down by the Indus. What was Cunningham carting off to London? Was he carting off precious Indian antiquities, sculptures from Bharhut or Gandhar, whatever? So there's been this mystery all these years, since the late 19th century, about what went down with the ship, that is the Indus. And I'm not going to ruin the mystery. I mean, that is there for people to read the book, but I'll just read out an excerpt from one of the letters, where he tells Beglar about having lost so much when the Indus sank off the coast of Sri Lanka. Quote, "I am the modern Polycrates." This is an allusion to a Greek myth. "Barring the loss of my property by fire some years ago, I have been tolerably fortunate. but now I am caught. About 45 boxes are at the bottom of the sea off the coast of Ceylon in the steamer Indus. No cargo can be recovered. Most of the books I can get again, but how can I replace my wife's portrait and all my father's papers, as well as all my own? I have very little left now. All my photographs are gone, except those of Mahabodhi. All my photographic books are now in the possession of the mermaids. I have not a single copy of Ashok's inscriptions, and all the photos of the inscriptions of the Corpus Inscriptionum Indicarum, which is a collection, a book that contained collection of Ashok's inscriptions. All the photos of Ashok's inscriptions are now puzzling the Nagas below. My completed work on Indian mosaics, texts, and plates, all ready for press, gone all. Trellis plates, this is a book on trellis plates that he was working, gone. But then after reporting that he's lost so much, he says, I'm now working at the Mansehra inscriptions of Ashok. There are altogether 4 rocks inscribed. And then he ends by saying, when you can come to Calcutta, let me know beforehand so that I may stay at home. And he signs off, as he does in many of his letters, I am always your sincere friend, Alexander Cunningham. So there's this big blow that he experiences. You know, all his precious things go down with the Indus. And the fact that he mentions his wife's portrait, I mean, that's something that seems to pain him the most. But by the end of the letter, he recovers his composure and he's busy working again. I mean, he's not one to sit and cry and at what has happened. He's back to work. He was a workaholic, basically.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I'm glad you mentioned something about Cunningham the man, because to me, something that stood out was Cunningham's sense of humor. And if I may say so, in marked contrast to the very when you lose man, it's quite a contrast. I mean, I was remembering, for instance, 1879, the book that he had published on Bharut. One of the things he bitterly complained about was the Buddha image that he had recovered from Shravasti, and that image had been housed in the Museum of the Asiatic Society of Bengal. Apparently, it had been put together with a herd of deer and antelope. And Cunningham famously said that maybe this is a way of expressing homage to the Buddha, who in his previous lives had been the king of the deer. It was a satirical comment on the way the museums were arranged between naturalist historians and archaeologists, antiquarians. But, do you want to say something about Cunningham's sense of humor?
Well, there's there are a lot of puns and in the letters. And also, you're right, he has a wicked sense of humor. For instance, Beglar wanted to go on leave. That's the other thing, the humdrum things that the archaeologists were worried about. How are we going to get the money in the field? Beglar was desperate to get leave and he was not being given leave by the government. And by the way, he had all kinds of political ambitions also. He was an Armenian with great interest in Armenian politics. So at one point, I remember Cunningham said that, I hope you have not run off to join the Tsar. I mean, where are you? I mean, you've gone on leave, but I hope you haven't run off to join the Tsar. So that was a reference to his kind of Beglar's interest in great admiration for Russia and for things Russian. And there are several letters which refer to his travels, through Eurasia and his voyage of discovery, so to speak. I think there are various small things. I wouldn't say there's nothing particular that comes to mind, but the letters are really peppered with humorous remarks. Not just humorous remarks, but very affectionate, casual remarks. For instance, some of the letters close with "Say my salam to Bull." Bull was the nickname of Beglar's son. And so there are these things. And I remember yes, Sanjukta, there is one thing more that I remember in the context of amusing comments. In one place, Cunningham is talking about photographs of the Bharhut Stoop. And he asks Beglar whether there are any photographs he can send him of the fruits that are depicted in the relief sculptures at Bharhut. And then he says, by the way, I don't even have a photograph of you. So if you ran away from the Archaeological Survey of India, I wouldn't know how to, what to put out. So please do send me a photograph of yourself, apart from the photographs of the sculptures at the Bharhut Stoop. So there are these little asides and all the interesting asides in the various letters.
Right. It's a lot about Cunningham, and of course, rightfully so. How does Beglar come into the picture? I was also thinking Beglar finds frequent mentions in Cunningham's reports, monographs as his zealous assistants. In what ways do you think this letter puts Beglar under the arc lights?
Well, Beglar initially comes across as somebody who does not come up to the mark as far as Cunningham is concerned. Cunningham is constantly scolding him for theorizing too much, for not concentrating on description and on accurate description. He scolds him for his crazy theories and for his bad spellings and grammar and wrong diacritics. But very soon they become friends, and they're very much comrades in arms. They planned all their explorations together, their itineraries dovetailed into each other's. Beglar himself, what does he come across as? Well, we have Cunningham's version of Beglar in these letters. But he comes across, I think the most interesting thing about Beglar is really that he was so politically oriented. You would never imagine that this man who was working for the Public Works Department in Bengal was so obsessed with Armenian politics and visualized himself as possibly playing a role in the Congress of Vienna, or creating a splash on the European diplomatic front. Of course, nothing of that sort happened, but he had these visions of himself as playing a major diplomatic role in Balkan politics.
Okay. One more question that I have for you. If we have time, I could go ahead, but at least one, which is, I thought a major takeaway for me from the book was that one cannot look at the interface between European officers, European officials of the Archaeological Survey of India and Indian employees at various levels through a very clean black and white prism. There are shades of gray. How would you react to such a statement? That it's a complex relationship that needs to be carefully analyzed.
I would agree, Sanjukta. In fact, while going through these letters, I didn't change my mind about a lot of things, but I did feel that things were more complex than I might have imagined. For instance, Cunningham very famously, when he was a young man, wrote, and when he was trying to make a case for an archaeological survey of North India, he wrote that an archaeological survey would tell us more about the Indian past than all the rubbish contained in the 18 Purans. This is a famous statement he made. But if you read the letters, he actually was full of admiration for the textual scholars like Max Miller. He was in regular correspondence with Faustball, Childers, Subhuti, various textual scholars, also those who are working on Chinese texts and inscriptions. So complex relationship. His relationship with James Ferguson, which I thought was marked by complete dislike throughout. The letters indicate that was not so initially. It was only when they fell out over the Mahabodhi restoration that the cordial relationship became very, 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 very sour. So there were all these new sorts of insights that the letters offer, and also about the Indians who were involved in archaeology and in the study of India's early past. I'd always got the impression that unlike someone like James Ferguson, who was frankly very racist in his contempt for Indian intellectuals, Cunningham was much more measured. If you read his reports and his various works, he cites Indians, he cites Ramras, he cites Sayyid Ahmad Khan, he cites various Indian scholars like Rajendra Lal Mitra. And the letters confirm that. And the letters also, he refers to Bhaudaji, he refers to Bhagwan
Bhagwan
Wal.
Lal, Indraji, yes.
Yes. But, there was, I think, there's, of course, the larger colonial context and the unequal power relations that we have to keep in mind. When we're looking at the history of archaeology in the 19th century, this is a history that was rooted in a colonial context in which Indians, the so-called natives, were not treated as the equals of Europeans. So that really does come across in the letters as well. And I think compared to his contemporaries, Cunningham's attitude towards Indian scholars, and not only Indian scholars, even his draftsman, Jamna Shankar Bhatt, you find that he does acknowledge the role of even his Indian subordinates. But he does have a somewhat complex relationship with intellectuals like Rajendra Lal Mitra, because there was collaboration, but there was also competition between among these men.
Yes, I remember a sentence from your introduction, which I really liked, that archaeology was a competitive sport. And,
Absolutely.
I think if I could ask you one last question, and if you could respond to that very briefly, this is about, a larger interest that both you and I are aware of among the general public, the well-read public, who may not be specialists in archaeology, about the history of Indian archaeology. And I find that this sort of book appeals to a large number of people, a very lucid introduction, the context of the letters. But you have to agree that the survival of these letters has been fortuitous. You don't have too many such instances. So in the absence of sources of this kind, what are some of the other interesting, accessible ways that people can read about archaeology? I was thinking of, do you have autobiographies in mind, for instance?
Well, the point you've made, Sanjukta, is very important, because there's a lot of interest in early Indian history among ordinary people. There is interest in archaeology, but scholars, historians, academics usually write for other academics. They do not write for a wider public. And as I've grown older and hopefully wiser a little bit, I've come to realize that it is very important to write in a way that is accessible to people who have an interest in the subject, and not to talk only to a narrow audience of academics. I think that's extremely important. So there are books on the history of Indian archaeology. You have Dilip Chakrabarty's 2-volume work. You have Nayanjot Lai's much more accessible and readable works on the discovery of the Indus civilization, and also on M.N. Deshpande recently, and her book Monuments Matter. I think her work is important here. Of course, Sankalia has, we have in his own words, the great Indian archaeologist Sankalia, Born to Archaeology. That's a wonderful book. I think more archaeologists need to write autobiographies, and we need more biographies also that are written not in a sort of stiff and tedious and dull manner, but really that bring alive not only the professional, but also the personal side of the stories of these people who have played such an important role in unearthing the early Indian past.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think your book really opens up a new vista there. There's so much that we get to know about Cunningham and Beglar, much more than their entwined archaeological lives. They're important, no doubt, but there's, so much more. So I think there are 5 more minutes. So maybe we could open it up for questions, and let me not ask you anything more right away, right? Are I haven't yet seen a question, so I could go ahead, or should I wait? Okay, no questions yet. Oh, great for us. I can make up for my lost time, which is, would you talk about any book that played in your mind while you were writing this book? Either somebody's accessible ways of writing, or Cunningham's own monograph, or the history of archaeology from probably some other part of the world. Something that was playing on your mind, for instance.
Sanjukta, no. I mean, the way I work is to immerse myself completely in the material that I'm working with. In this case, the letters themselves. And then what I wrote, basically in the introduction, emerged from that very, very intense immersion into those sources, that is the letters. So there was no book or work that I had in mind that inspired me or influenced me when I wrote this book. Of course, I did have in mind my own previous book on the history of archaeology, and I wanted this to be different. I had to recall some of the conclusions of that book, but I also wanted to convey to the reader that this is something, this source material, these letters are really something unusual and unique. You don't usually come across this kind of material. It's quite sensational.
No. Yes.
So,
and I was thinking, go ahead.
It was a privilege to be able to edit these letters and to write about them.
True. There's something that struck me, which is the fact that these letters are housed in the Victoria Memorial Hall in Calcutta, is in some ways life coming full circle, because a lot of the correspondence happens in Calcutta. I was thinking, for instance, a silver cast copy of a Mahabodhi temple model was being made in Kolkata, the famous photographic firms, Bone and Shepherd. My aunts, for instance, have got their pre-wedding photo shoots. It was the done thing, Bone and Shepherd. So, those kinds of Calcutta landmarks, the Grand Hotel coming in, I thought that's a very exciting bit in the life history of the letters as artifacts.
You're absolutely right. I mean, Kolkata was the center. Calcutta was the center at that time, and Cunningham basically used to hang around there. Well, he didn't hang around much. He didn't like the heat, by the way. He didn't like the Kolkata weather. So in the winters, he would move around, on his various archaeological field trips, and in summers he would go to Simla. He couldn't bear the Indian heat. So he would go to a place, a house which still exists, called Fir Hill. And then, and for me, these places are important. And I've tried to actually get photographs of some of these places that were associated with Beglar's life, with Cunningham's life, because the book is about many things. It's about people, it's about places, it's about archaeology, it's about history. And for me, finding visual material is extremely important. And I did actually spend a lot of time chasing down various leads. Believe me, it's not easy to get photographs in the midst of a pandemic, but many people helped me find photographs, for instance, early 20th century photographs of, the places where Cunningham stayed when he was in Kolkata or in Simla, Fir Hill. So, that's part of the excitement, actually. One of the most exciting parts of producing this book was locating the visuals, the photographs for it.
I'm glad you referred to the visuals, because that's something I would have said probably at the end, that, something so exciting about the book is bringing to life not just these two people who were pivotal in the history of Indian archaeology, but as you said, places, landmarks, milestones were, very, very significant. Also, interestingly, this is a photographic tribute to Beglar, who's remembered in Indian archaeology for his superb photographic documentation. And as you have rightly pointed out, that his appointment began on the basis that he was a fantastic photographer, and Cunningham, realizing the importance of visual documentation, took him on, right?
Absolutely. And Sanjukta, Beglar is still remembered in Chakdaha.
Right.
He was the
Right.
founder of the municipality there. And
Yes.
he is remembered. It's amazing that a man who lived in the 19th century, the memory of this man is still alive in the place in which he lived today. His house is no more, but I managed to get a photograph of the house in a rather dilapidated state.
Yes. Yes.
So memories live on.
That's true. That's true. Maybe that's the last sentence on which we can conclude that memory lives on.
Absolutely.
So, well, thank you. Thank you for this fantastic conversation. 15 minutes of which I unfortunately lost, but I hope the audience got a lot directly from the horse's mouth.
Thank you very much, Sanjukta.
Okay. Bye.
And thanks to the organizers of the Pune International Literary Festival for giving us this opportunity of having such an interesting conversation.
Yes, yes. I would add a +1 to that. Thank you very much.
Right.
Thank you for such a captivating conversation. Dr. Sanjukta Datta and Professor Dr. Upinder Singh, thank you for being our esteemed guests at PILF 2021. We will begin our next discussion, The Power of Poem, after a break of 15 minutes. Thank you.